Now, today we are nearing the end of both the series and Mark's gospel, and we find ourselves at the heart of the Christian story. But before we just jump into it, let me ask you a question. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt completely lost, with no idea to even, how to even begin to find your way out? Maybe it was when you lost a job, or your career path took an unexpected turn and suddenly the future felt unclear. Or maybe it was when you received difficult news, a diagnosis, a fractured relationship, an unexpected loss, and it felt like the ground beneath you shifted. These moments where everything was familiar all of a sudden fade, and you're left feeling powerless and unsure of the way around. These moments are hard and dark and vulnerable. And today, we find ourselves in that kind of moment. That kind of moment for Jesus and his disciples. We read, "Then the soldiers nailed him to the cross. They divided his clothes and threw dice to decide who would get each piece. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. A sign announced the charge against him. It read, 'The King of the Jews.' 2 revolutionaries were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. The people passing by shouted abuse, shaking their heads in mockery. 'Ha! Look at you now,' they yelled at him. 'You said you were going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days? Well then, save yourself and come down from the cross.' The leading priests and teachers of religious law also mocked Jesus. 'He saved others,' they scoffed, 'but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down from the cross so we can see it and believe him.' Even the men who were crucified with Jesus ridiculed him." Imagine the anguish Jesus, his followers, disciples, all who followed him must have felt as they stood near the cross, watching the man they had followed for years now suffer and die. This was the one who calmed the storms, right? Who had that authority. The one who healed the sick and even defied death with a mere word. Even just days earlier to this, he had entered Jerusalem to cheers of crowds welcoming him as a king. And then to add to this moment of confusion and disorientation, Mark tells us that at noon, darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. Now, I want to linger in this verse today. It is tempting for me to move on to the contrast of light that will appear and make sense of the cross and go back to those theologies that we have developed to understand God and say, yes, but look, this is what happens. But I think for today, for this story of the Jesus the King and his authority, it's important for us to just linger here. So can I invite you, especially if you have been a long church attender, or if you've read the Bible or you're a Bible reader, to begin to explain this moment in your head. To not jump ahead in the story and make sense of it and already be articulating everything that's going to happen, but just to stay here, to linger in this darkness. There's this mystery of the darkness, and then there's a disorientation that happens in it. Mark wants us, and he's inviting us to feel the confusion and fear. There hangs the King of the Jews, and the land goes dark. But amid the darkness of confusion, disorientation, and lost identity, Mark wants us to see that even there, in that moment, that the cross becomes the place where Jesus reveals God. It is at the cross where Jesus is reshaping and renewing our understanding of true authority. He's been preparing us all the way through the Gospel of Mark for this moment. Look what he taught us and the disciples earlier. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others and to give his life as a ransom for many. The truth that our God is servant king, if we're honest, can be disorientating. We might say it, but when life gets hard, when things go wrong, when we find ourselves in the darkness and disorientation, we want a victorious God, one who will crush our enemies and fix everything. That's the God, that's the King who's easy to proclaim. But a dying, vulnerable, serving God, even if we acknowledge it, living out that truth is far more difficult than we'd like to admit. When we see the cross, when it becomes the focal point, the center of our hope, when we find ourselves in life's darkest moments in our vulnerability, the cross seems to actually offer hope. Vulnerability actually seems to heal. Let me give you some examples. When we long for freedom, we might seek it from someone who's never been imprisoned. But how much more freeing it is to be led by someone who was captive like us, yet now walks in freedom. When we crave healing, we might turn to someone untouched by suffering, but how much more comforting it is to be held by someone who has felt our pain and carries our scars. When we search for direction, we might look for someone who's never been lost, but how much more life-giving it is to be guided by someone who has wandered and been found. This is precisely why the cross in the darkness, that emptying that happens to Jesus, is exactly where Jesus meets us. Not above our struggles, but right in the heart of them. Friends, when we begin to understand this, that is at the center of our pain is exactly where God meets us. Then, and finally then, we begin to understand this King's confusing invitation. Then calling the crowd to join his disciples, he said, "If any of you want to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross, and follow me." Take up your cross and follow me. Jesus said this way before he's on the cross. And it's hard. It's hard to understand it. Following Jesus means stepping into his way of life, giving up my own way, my own authority. Jesus says, "Follow me, because the Son of Man came to serve and not be served." And so he invites this invitation and extends it to us to embrace a life of servanthood, to follow him. And honestly, servanthood at times feels like it doesn't make sense, especially if it's not for our benefit, or especially if things just don't move forward, right? It can be frustrating when you're serving and you're helping, but things are just not getting better. People are kind of still staying in the same place. You're like, what am I doing this for? Should I even help? Like, nothing's changing. And this is the paradox of the cross, because it's not a strategy. It only begins to make sense when we see it as the path to encounter God. It's not a hidden tactic for authority. It is the way we come face to face with God.